You will not believe who slapped me at my son's anniversary dinner and why the police were at their table minutes later. We had been sitting under the hotel ballroom chandeliers, the light catching on crystal and champagne bubbles, when she rose from her chair like a practiced actress and crossed to me with that polite smile. I had come for the anniversary, to be seen, to be civil, to honor my boy's life with the woman he had married, and I had expected the usual perfunctory niceties: small talk, a clink of glasses, a toast. Instead, her hand came up and struck my cheek so suddenly that for a second the sound of it seemed to belong to someone else, a crisp, sharp sound. Not a slap meant to frighten, but a performance, clean, deliberate, meant for others to witness. The room fell into that rare, terrible silence that follows an unexpected thing. Forks paused midway to mouths. The band stuttered. My son's face changed in a way I had only ever seen in photographs of men being caught. He went white as the napkin at his elbow. I put my hand to where she had hit me, and it was absurdly, embarrassingly warm. I felt the sting and the blood pressure rush that comes with surprise, but more than that, I felt a distinct and strange sort of calm, as if the light that had been dimly on some problem finally turned full. People leaned forward, hungry for spectacle. The daughter-in-law, Vanessa, as she introduced herself to everyone in town, smoothed her dress and arranged the hall around her outrage, her eyes asking for an audience. She had chosen the moment and the place. That was the point, a public spectacle intended to reduce me into a private apology and a quiet disappearance. "Mom," my son whispered. He was so small in that instant, like a boy caught with his hand in the cookie jar. "You shouldn't have." She interrupted him, loud and theatrical. "I will not allow you to humiliate my family," she said, speaking to the room as much as to me. "This woman has been undermining our marriage." That was the script they expected to follow: shock, retreat, remorse. They expected me to accept the narrative that I, the older woman who had built a life and a home, was interfering, that I had overstepped some invisible boundary. They expected tears or anger or a hasty exit. They expected a scene that would be retold later with embellishment, a story that would make me look small, petty, difficult. They expected to write the ending. Instead, I smiled. It was not a smile of triumph. It was careful and small, like a lock clicked into place. I folded my napkin and put it on the table. I let my hand rest on the place where her palm had landed, and I watched her watch me. They had all come to witness my humiliation. They were about to witness something else. If you like dramatic life stories, subscribe, because sometimes the quiet ones are the ones that change everything. It is important you understand why that slap did not ruin me. It is important you understand that the slap, as outrageous as it appeared, was no accident. It was the punctuation mark on weeks of small alterations to the life I had known. A calendar entry here, a change in tone there, a late-night call to my son that pushed a grin across his face the next morning, a perfume I did not recognize at my front door. The slap was meant to force me into a decision I had not yet been coaxed into taking. What I had in my hands when I left that table was not the sting on my cheek, but a certain clarity. I had, over the last month or so, been collecting small things and putting them where they belonged. I had been reading the margin notes of a life that others assumed they could edit. The first thing that put me on alert was the calendar. My son had always been a man of lists: grocery lists, carte blanche schedules, reminders for oil changes. He lived in his phone the way some people live in books. A month before the anniversary, his calendar beeped at me one morning without meaning to. I had been up early, making coffee, and his phone lay on the kitchen counter where he had set it down. Messages popped up, an innocuous small window with the header S 11 p.m. I tapped it to clear it. No harm meant, of course. But that little box had a distance to it. For a man who shared everything, it seemed a private place. Then there were the bank notices. They are the things people forget to hide. A transfer here, a flagged withdrawal there. My son and I had not shared an account for years, but for convenience, he'd offered to help with some bills after an injury. Nothing more than that. He is generous in ways that get him into trouble. A few late-night messages from Vanessa about covering until Monday made me arch an eyebrow. I asked casually one afternoon over tea about an odd transfer. He said it had been a mistake. He promised to correct it. I accepted his promise with the same blind trust you offer a child who swears they will mow the lawn. But promises are currency. They lose their value quickly if not backed by receipts. There was an aroma, too, something floral and deliberately faint. I found it once on my son's sweater, once lingering on the throw pillow he had left on my sofa after a visit. Vanessa's perfume, I later learned, had a note of bergamot and something green, verdant and expensive. It was the kind of scent that announces itself in a crowd and insists you remember its owner. It was in that scent that I began to stitch together an idea that this was not only about marital friction. It was a plan. You measure people by what they hide poorly. The more you watch, the more you can predict the next move. I began to watch. I took to small investigations the way I take to gardening, quietly, with attention and patience. You can judge soil just by the way a seed behaves. You can tell the character of a whole household by the way its people guard their phones. A text that would have been meaningless to anyone else became a thread when seen in context. On his phone, a message from a contact listed as H, a name I had never heard, read simply, "Plan for the night. Make her leave. She signs." The message was crisp, clinical. Later, when confronted, they would claim it was about a different her or that the message had been misread. But when you know the way language works inside conspiracies, you know that words are weapons and vagueness is a shield. I should pause to say, I did not become a detective overnight. I am a woman who had spent her life in the rails of modest dignity. My rights, my property, my security were simple, documented things. A title deed to a condominium bought before my son married, life insurance policies, an inheritance from a sister no one had been told about until probate closed. The law can be blunt and kind in equal measure. It cares about dates and signatures. It is not poetic, but it is reliable. I reached out to an old friend, Aisha, who practices law not because she loves the courts, but because she loves the clarity of a signed line. She is my age and has the soft iron of someone who never allows herself illusions. "Bring me everything," she said when I told her the slap story. And the way she said it made me happier than any sympathy. The law loves proof, and she smells it when it is nearby. We started with documents. There was a deed in a leather folder that I had kept in a bottom drawer. A small, sensible condo purchased in the ugly summer of 2009 when the market was pocked with worry. The deed had the stamp and the county clerk's flourish and a date that put it firmly before my son's marriage. I had handed it to him once as a piece of family history, noting that a house is not only walls, but a record that cannot be rewritten without someone's signature. A copy of the deed is more powerful when shown at a table in a ballroom than it is when it sits in a drawer. That would be important later. Evidence needs an audience. We also looked at financial statements, transfers that had been routed through accounts with names I did not fully recognize, withdrawals that coincided with nights my son had been out, and a pattern of repayment notes that lacked the clear handwriting of remorse. A line of payments to a consultant stood out, a number that matched the amount an outside lawyer might charge for settling unpleasant matters. There was also a recent charge at a title office for document drafting that had no explanation. When you pull at one tight knot, sometimes the whole sweater begins to unravel. I must emphasize how careful we were. I did not want to be the woman who shrieked and flailed and then found herself humiliated in return for a false alarm. My temperament is the slow kind. I prefer to be right and not loud. So we gathered, we documented, we copied every message and printed every transaction, we time-stamped and notarized when it was prudent. Aisha taught me to treat emotion as an untrustworthy witness. Truth is the matter you present. Fury is the commentary under it. It is worth noting the role of the fixer, the small character who smells like evasion and calls themselves indispensable. In our story, he went by the name Hayes. Hayes is the sort of person who keeps his card folded in the back pocket rather than the wallet. He prefers whispers to email and cash to columns. He had appeared on the edges of my son's life as someone offering help, smoothing over small embarrassments, moving money, drafting unsigned letters. There is no mystery in people who sell impossibilities. They meet you where your morals have thinned. Hayes had, it turned out, been paid. Not openly, always through channels that leave plausible deniability. A wire into an account in a different state, a cash envelope left in the back of a car, a contract with a blank signature. These are the things that make conspiracies look professional. But professional conspiracies are sloppy in their human places. They leave traces in the restaurant reservations, in the hotel check-ins, in the calendar entries. One message we found on my son's phone, the one that made me sit up straight and stop pretending not to understand, read, "Make sure she signs. We can't proceed without the property." It was from a number saved as V. When we confronted my son with it, he blinked. "I thought that was someone else," he said. "I didn't read it." You cannot build a plan on someone who didn't read it. You can, however, expose that plan. There are important small meannesses that come before the big ones. The way Vanessa asked to be introduced to my friends as my in-laws rather than naming me. The way invitations to family dinners shifted. Suddenly my son was always the one apologizing on my behalf, calling me eccentric in the same breath as he described himself as loyal. The things that seem like an attempt at gentle rebranding are, at times, brushstrokes of erasure. We began, quietly, to prepare. Preparation is different from plotting. Preparation is the act of making sure the facts are lined up with the story you intend to tell. It is choosing the correct filing cabinet, making photocopies, and ensuring there are witnesses who will corroborate the sequence of events. It is also knowing when to let the others make a mistake. I moved some accounts into my own name over the course of a week, little transfers, innocuous notes to my bank, an evening spent with a patient manager who taught me how to make modest investments. I had an inheritance recently cleared through probate, money that belonged to me outright. For 3 decades, I had considered it something distant. Now it felt like ballast. I opened a new account at a bank around the corner from my condo, one that did not have a history with my son's name. It felt strange to do something so absolutely grown up, a change that belonged to me and me alone. I also made allies. There are people who, for reasons of long friendship or quiet obligation, will stand in a room and bear witness. Bud, a CEO friend from work who had the kind of reputation that made people think twice before interrupting, agreed to be at the anniversary. Another cousin, someone who had seen my son at his worst and best, promised to sit at my table and notice faces. Small moral banks filled as quietly as financial ones. We planned the night not around confrontation, but around evidence. That was crucial. Evidence does not need theatricality. It only needs clarity. A deed with a date, bank statements with a line of transfers, messages laid out in order. The last thing I wanted was to look like a woman with a grudge. I wanted to look like a woman with paperwork. In the days before the anniversary, the tension grew. Vanessa was outwardly serene. She smiled on social media with a professional grin, posting staged images of the dinner invitations and tagging a caterer like an actress placing credits on a resume. She sent my son a dozen packets of polite messages that could be narrated either as warmth or as tactical reminders. My son began to avoid looking at my face in conversation, which made it easier for him to look anywhere else. There was one Saturday morning, a week before the dinner, when I saw them together at the farmer's market. Vanessa had on a straw hat, the kind of look that says effortless. She reached for a peach and her fingers brushed my son's. He laughed at something she said. He was so easy with her that day that I felt an ache, not of jealousy, but of recognition that something in him had changed. People's loyalties shift slowly and then all at once. I remember the exact way the sun caught her hair that morning and how absurd it felt that a summer's light could be part of a plan. You might think that in all of this, my son was an accomplice by design. He was, in fact, more like a man swayed by the sweet convenience of dishonesty. He believed for a while in the comfort of smoothing over problems by delegating them. He had always forgiven himself in advance with phrases like, "I'll fix it tomorrow," or "I meant well." When people are convenient, they are easy to use. When they are used, they are slippery to restore. It is one of the ironies of betrayal that the betrayer usually does not see themselves as a villain. My son clasped his hands around an idea of himself that had always been scrupulous and generous. When confronted with the evidence that he had been acting otherwise, he looked not like a conspirator, but like a man meeting the truth for the first time. We rehearsed nothing because script cannot survive truth. Instead, Aisha and I laid out the evidence in a folder that could be taken from my bag as casually as one might remove a lipstick. In it was a notarized copy of the deed, bank statements printed in bold columns, a series of text messages arranged in chronological order, and a small affidavit from Bud, who would testify not to feelings but to what he had heard. Law, as Aisha likes to say, is the business of making private facts public in an orderly way. There was a complication, which is always the case. Hayes was a ghost who had left traces, a wire to an out-of-state account that returned a trail to a small LLC with no employees, and a contract with a blank signature line that implied forged intent. Those traces suggested a blueprint for removing me from the picture. The more I saw, the less they looked like improvisation, and the more they looked like craft. I did not tell my son everything at once. The conversation that followed the slap was quiet. He stammered apologies, of the sort that begged absolution rather than asking for forgiveness. He proposed a plan to appease everyone, an apology to Vanessa, a brunch to reset, a promise that he would set boundaries with his wife. But apologies are cheap when property is at stake. I told him simply that I would not be shamed into signing anything I had not already read. He looked panicked. Panic is the honest face of a man who finally recognizes the map others have drawn in his name. Vanessa, for her part, was charmingly unconcerned in those first minutes after the slap. She drank a glass of wine and told a story to an old college friend as if she had only sharpened a pen. It was theatrical, and theater requires practice. Her calm was brittle. When the band resumed and the room hummed again with small talk, she looked to the exits as if waiting for her cue. I went home that night to a quiet apartment that smelled faintly of lemon oil and the pages of a book I had been meaning to finish. I lay awake thinking, not of revenge, that low, ugly cousin of justice, but of what it felt like to be erased in people's minds. I thought about the people who had sat at the table. I thought about the way the world accepts narrative if it is pretty and convenient. I thought about how hard it is to get people to look twice. The next morning, I started the work that would become the spine of our counter. I met with Aisha downtown in a small office that smelled of old folders and coffee. She had printed copies of everything, the chain of title for my condo, the bank statements, the message strings. She had already made a plan for how to present it. Public event, she said, tapping the anniversary invite sitting between us, is where you will be strongest. If I make a scene, I asked, thinking of the hotel room and abandoned chairs, won't they say I'm dramatic? They will say what they like, Aisha said. You will show what is true. It is a mercy, sometimes, to have a friend who sees the world in certificates and dates. They make the emotional less urgent and the factual more urgent. I prefer the latter. We practiced a speech that I never fully planned to give. It consisted not of accusations, but of statements. This deed bears a date, I would say, holding it up. These transfers are listed here. I would read a message aloud if necessary, not as an act of triumph, but as an act of clarity. The law is not rhetorical, it is documentary. Present the paper, state the fact, allow the room to do with those facts what decorum permitted. Bud called the day before the dinner and said the seating was arranged so that one table listened more easily than another. Sit near the center, he advised, not in the shadows. He is a man who understands optics. People are persuaded by where they look. There was practical work as well. I took photographs of documents and had them backed up in 2 email accounts, always remembering that paper can singe and stories can vanish. I withdrew small sums and placed them into an account only I could access. It felt illicit and, at the same time, deeply necessary. There is a dignity to being able to pay for your own defense. And then there were the moral decisions. One could respond to a slap with violence, rumor, public shaming, blackmail. That is not my way. When the profession of your adulthood has been small acts of decency, you suddenly find violence taste wrong. I wanted the record to be kept clear and the consequences to be proportional to the acts. It was not about breaking them, it was about making the record straight. The night of the anniversary arrived, and with it a kind of theatrical air that made the city seem like a stage. I wore a dress that belonged to a decade ago, but was tailored with a modern seam. I knew the cameras would be there, phones everywhere. In our world, no event is private. The chandelier light caught on the ink of the deed as I tucked the folder into the leather bag under my chair. My son hugged me before the doors opened, his breath smelling faintly of the hotel cologne he had picked for the evening. His eyes were small, and I think he believed, with the strange stubbornness of a man who wants to be forgiven, that apologies could smooth this. He whispered, "I'm sorry," in a way that did not match the damage. I patted his hand and said, "We will talk," meaning we will talk when this is over. Sometimes silence is a shield. I sat at the table and watched the room assemble. Vanessa arrived late, entree prepared and poised. She greeted me with a smile like a drawn curtain. The band began with something sentimental. Toasts were made, speeches were scheduled. Her father, a man whose laugh could fill this room, took a moment to praise the new couple. I listened because people hear things differently when they believe the world holds its breath for them. Everything in me wanted to tell the room what they did not know, that the slap was not a spontaneous defense, but a designed moment, that the woman who had struck me had been orchestrating the scene for weeks, that my son's casual promises were not innocent missteps, but parts of a plan. But the theater of revelation is a dangerous place for an unprepared woman, and I was prepared. At some point during the dessert, a microphone was brought to the middle of the room. Your eyes know where to go when a microphone appears. People lean in, they offer their time like a currency. My son stood and called for attention. He spoke at first about love, as men do at such times, speaking in the soft, palatable terms of middle-aged marriages. His voice cracked on a word, and I felt something inside me cold and sure. They had planned to make me the distraction. He was about to make me the villain for the story he and Vanessa preferred. I reached into my bag and slid the folder out. It was heavier than it looked. The deed sat atop everything, a plain rectangle of paper with a stamp that rendered it immovable. I had not intended to interrupt. I had intended to let the documents do their work. But when the look on Vanessa's face sharpened, part triumph and part impatience, I rose. There is a particular silence that falls when an uninvited voice interrupts a well-constructed scene. It is not the silence of interest, but of unblinking attention. I could feel eyes on me, as if I were the one heaving the curtains back on a stage. "I am sorry to interrupt," I said, And my voice was the voice of a woman who had done her homework. But there are some facts worth stating while we are all gathered. They were not expecting it. They liked their narrative unchallenged. When you disrupt a story, people instinctively look for an explanation that restores comfort. But evidence is stubborn. I placed the deed on the table and slid the printed messages beside it. The paper made a small sound like a leaf. Vanessa's composure stiffened, as if she had been expecting applause instead of quiet scrutiny. That is where I will leave you for now, with the papers on the table, with eyes turned in my direction, with the room waiting to see whether the evidence will be met with the expected denial or whether the truth will begin to unspool. The rest, the part where apologies are demanded or police are called, where reputations slide, where debts are tallied and consequences are assigned, happens next. But in this moment, when the chandelier sparkles and the band has been politely asked to pause, there is a hush that belongs to consequence. I am not a woman who desires spectacle. I do not revel in the discomfort of others. My focus has always been clear: a life kept intact, a home that will not be erased. If they wanted a scene, I will show them the facts. If they wanted judgment, I will allow the community to render its verdict. I have already taken back my agency in small, careful steps. The rest is a matter of recorded truth. You can imagine, perhaps, what the room might do. You can imagine the glares, the apologies that will be asked for, the whispering that will follow. But you will have to wait to see how people react when a simple deed is placed, like a declaration, on a table full of pretense. There is one thing I will say in closing this chapter, before the night unfolds into its consequences. When someone strikes you because they want you hidden, do not quietly vacate your seat. Sometimes staying still is how you begin to rewrite the ending. The hush lasted long enough for people to start looking for the cue they'd rehearsed. A lawyerly denial, a wounded silence, a host to ease everyone back into their programs. Instead, I let the papers speak. I did not shout. I did not demand people's attention with theatrics. I read aloud, slowly, the line from the bank statement that matched the transfer amount we had circled a dozen times in the office with Aisha. I turned the page and read the text thread from V, where a message said, plainly, "Make her leave. She signs tonight." I read the note of a wire to a different state, and the description on a receipt that named a settlement fee. Words have weight when they are backed by ink and stamps. The room shifted. You could feel the air rebalancing, as if the chandelier itself had tilted, and everyone had to rebalance their posture to keep from falling with it. My son stood up so quickly, his chair made that sound. Not a fall, but the sound of something unbalanced. He came to my side, hands useless in the face of paper. "Mom, this is," he started, the sentence collapsing on the evidence on the table like a voiceover crushed by its own soundtrack. Vanessa's face had been an artful mask of indignation for the better part of the evening. The mask cracked, in the way expensive porcelain will when a single hairline fracture runs through it. She laughed once, a short, brittle sound, as if laughter could smooth the edges of a fact. "This is a stunt," she said. "You have no right to." "And yet," I said, as calmly as I had the first night I found the calendar entry, "you arranged bank transfers to accounts outside the family and discussed making me leave in messages addressed to people I do not know. That is not an opinion. That is a record." There was the inevitable chorus of murmurs. Phones lifted. People pressed record. A few pushed forward, not to hear me, but to be the first to capture the moment that would be replayed at work tomorrow and in group chats for weeks. In a world where reputation is currency, there is always at least one person who wants the exclusive. That is when Vanessa chose to change tactics. Her smile fell all the way off, and she struck out with words that were meant to wound and to distract. "You think you can come here and ruin us? You think you can buy people? She asked, an accusation posed as an accusation of my character. You are trying to make yourself a victim. These are my documents, I said. This deed predates your marriage. The transfers are to an account you control. The messages are from numbers saved under names you used. If you want to explain them, do so. She blinked, and for one bare second, her eyes went somewhere private, as if she were looking at the outline of the plan she had drawn and seeing, for the first time, its flaws. It is a peculiar thing to watch a self-constructed narrative collapse. People who build stories around polish and performance have few contingency plans for being presented with cold paper. You can't make me look bad to my family, she said, voice high. You can't. She broke off then, trying to remember which role she should play: victim, defender, or righteous avenger. The room needed a performance, and she had almost always chosen the version that earned the most applause. You do something stupid in public, Bud said from across the table in his low voice. You don't get to be surprised when someone points out that it was arranged. He is not a man prone to drama. He is a man who values straightforward statements. His presence that night had more to do with his sense of fairness than with friendship. He had walked in knowing none of the details, and now, like a judge without a robe, he had shifted into the only posture he seemed to care about: witness. At that moment, my phone buzzed against the inner bag of my purse. Aisha. I had not checked it. I didn't need to. She had told me the authorities were on standby. We had called the local fraud unit in the afternoon and given them what we had. I had been hesitant to escalate too far before the evidence was in place, but Aisha had stressed the risk of flight. Some people, when cornered, go for breaks in the road. While police presence had been a possibility, I had never wanted it to be the spectacle. I had wanted facts to do the heavy lifting. But once the facts were present and the conduct suggested a pattern that looked like misappropriation and forging of documents, law enforcement moved quickly. They had been given probable cause and an event where the subjects were unlikely to leave immediately, a banquet with every exit visible. Pragmatic, efficient, unromantic. 2 men in plain clothes entered. They did not shout, no one shouted. There was no dramatic rush. They approached with the gentle focus of people who had practiced the choreography of intervention. One showed his badge with a discreet flash. The other spoke in a quiet, controlled voice and asked for Miss Vanessa Hale, her last name pronounced like an accusation. For a second, she looked at them as if they were an expected part of the program. She laughed too loud, a sound that tried to be brave. Then the color from her face left in a way that made her lips look thinner. The 2 officers asked her to come with them for a few questions. They did so professionally, almost apologetically. They explained that there were allegations of fraud, of forged signatures, and that they needed to sort facts from feeling. They said she could come voluntarily, or they could do this another way. The room reeled in a way that made it clear people were processing a new template for the evening, a woman being both the accuser and the accused in the same room. Some guests pretended to be interested in their dessert. Others set their phones on tables and opened live stream apps with the same detached curiosity people used when they looked at a car crash. Social life is often a matter of seeing without being responsible. Tonight, that was harder to manage. Vanessa's eyes met my son's for a last plea. There was, in that glance, the small boy he used to be, umbilical with hope, and the man meant to be something else. He stood up, and for a moment I saw his hand tremble. "This is going to ruin you," he whispered to Vanessa, a plea swaddled as a threat. "Don't make it worse." She answered with something like a sob bark. "She is lying. She wants—" Her voice broke. She looked at the officers, then at the people, then at me as if she could choose which version of the night would stick. The officers led her gently toward the door. I watched her pass, a woman in a dress that had been chosen to catch light, now caught in a different kind of attention. A hand at her elbow, a whispered instruction. The moment was surreal because it was both ordinary and absolute. An arrest for suspected financial wrongdoing in the middle of a ballroom that had 15 minutes earlier been full of celebration. Nobody leapt to my defense. No one needed to. The room had already judged by the visible and the verifiable. That is how reputation is undone these days, not by theater, but by the patience of records. After she left, the conversation in the room shifted from whispers to a kind of stunned analysis. Some guests wrapped themselves in a kind of astonished curiosity. There were thin, awkward apologies to me from people who had spent the better part of an hour expecting a different story. Some of them were sincere, others were not. I do not keep a ledger on sincerity. It is a small, useless burden. My son sat down like a man undone. He did not look up at me. The band struck up a tune, and then, in the way bands are trained to do, they deflated into background noise, as if the music had been asked to be decorum for the discomfort of the living. The rest of the evening was an exercise in appropriateness and the weary need to pretend that life would continue. When the reporters found out, because of course they did, and because someone at the hotel had already been tipped, the story moved beyond the room. Guests uploaded snippets that gathered more views than honesty. The man's business contacts started to call to see what the story meant for his partnerships. Emails came, then texts. The world, I thought, had the decency to be efficient when it wanted to be ugly. A child of mine, even one who makes faulty choices, is still a child to be tended. When we finally spoke, long after the officers were gone and the guests had thinned, it was not in the sharp cadence of accusation, but in a voice that tried and failed to be composed. I didn't realize he started, and stopped. You didn't read the messages, I said. You didn't ask where transfers were going. You accepted explanations that should have made you pause. None of that was accidental. He put his head in his hands and said, I thought I could fix it. I thought I could keep everyone calm, and he trailed off. And for a while we simply sat in the private quiet that follows a public failure. My instinct was not to deliver his fate. My instinct was, as it had always been, to set the table for what had to happen next. If he wanted to repair things, he would have to do the work. If he wanted to apologize, he would have to make amends in more ways than words. There was a legal aftermath that moved outward from that night with the methodical predictability of ripples. The recording of Vanessa being led from the room was, predictably, everywhere. The bank put holds on suspicious accounts, while investigators followed the wires that had been routed through shell companies and consultants in other states. Hayes, the fixer, had left a pattern that was easier to trace than he expected. Paperwork left in an unsecured folder, a check that bore his name, a hotel receipt with a car service named on it. People who make careers of making trouble for others often forget that they too leave traces. Vanessa was not the only one to feel consequence. The company's board, where my son held a small executive role, convened and placed him on administrative leave pending inquiry. That was not forgiveness, it was risk management. The board's messages were polite but decisive. They could not afford to be associated with anything that looked like impropriety. His phone filled with texts from clients asking for clarity. He had to answer them or let silence do the work of speaking. There were legal battles that followed, as there always are. I did not relish them. They were tedious and necessary, an unpleasant civics lesson in what the law can do when applied with patience. The first was a temporary injunction to prevent any change in ownership of the condo while the matter was investigated. That was a simple thing because deeds have dates and because the deed in question had a county clerk's mark that was difficult to argue with. The second was a civil suit in which I sought declaratory judgment that my property, purchased and paid for before the marriage and unencumbered by the signatures of others, remained mine. There were hearings in rooms that smell faintly of disinfectant and old coffee, where a judge listened to lawyers who spoke in the precise language of statute and precedent. Aisha was there at my side in every one of them, not just as counsel, but as a stoic friend who had photographs of the messages and certified copies of the transfers. We presented the documents as simply as possible: the deed, the bank ledger, the messages in chronological order. It was not drama, it was work. The judge's ruling was not a coronation. He did not announce my moral victory. There is no such formal thing in a courtroom. He did, however, issue a decision that reaffirmed the dates and the signatures. The condo deed predated the marriage, and no binding instrument had been produced that legitimately transferred title away from me. In plain terms, the property remained mine. That was the legal end of one chapter. It was not a cure for heartbreak, but it was a firm enough line under an account that needed one. There were also criminal inquiries, investigations into transfers and into the possibility of forged signatures. Those matters moved through offices of county prosecutors and federal investigators. Hayes was arrested in another state on a contempt charge and on allegations that matched the patterns we had found. He had been the sort of man who thought himself expert at invisibility and was wrong. Vanessa faced charges that included forgery and fraud, as the investigation found evidence that some documents had been backdated and that signatures bore the hallmarks of being produced without the signer's full knowledge. I do not relish listing crimes like ingredients. They are not theater for me. Yet it is true that legal systems sometimes move with the speed of necessity when there are concrete leads. People like to imagine punishment as a tidy arc: misdeed, reckoning, neat closure. Reality is less neat. While there were arrests and charges and an eventual plea by one of the lesser figures in the scheme, much of the emotional work remained for the living to manage. Papers could be returned to drawers, titles could be reaffirmed, Republicans and Democrats could tweet. But the particular betrayals that had been played out in private and then aired publicly required a different, quieter remedy: reparation through honest labor and truth-telling. My son took his own path through accountability. He was not incarcerated. He spent time in mediation rooms and in therapy. He took an unpaid leave and did the small, stubborn work of calling people he had let down and telling them the truth. Truth is oddly hard for those who have spent their lives polishing narratives. He lost business opportunities and friends. Some relationships mended, some did not. He paid financial settlements, not because anyone wanted to punish him, but because the record demanded rectification. The sums involved were not scandalously large compared to corporate malfeasance, but they were enough to remind him that reputation is a fragile thing that, once frayed, takes years to weave back. Vanessa's trajectory was steeper and more public. The viral videos ensured that her professional life stalled. A boutique consultancy that had once courted her for her social talents distanced itself. Friends who had been casual in their loyalties filtered their contacts slowly, as one might siphon off water from a bathtub without making a mess. When you live by performance, you find out quickly how many people admired your props and how few admired your labor. That is a humbling lesson, sometimes for the victim, but often for the perpetrator. I do not tell you this to gloat. Schadenfreude is a small, cheap thing. I tell you because consequences are part of the moral grammar of our lives. People act, acts have results. The mass of witnesses that evening had rendered a kind of verdict already, and the instruments of law had simply formalized what common sense suggested, that theft, even the theft of agency, is a wrong. When things quieted, I found myself with an unexpected resource: time no longer tethered to the worry that had once been my default. There is a strange liberty that arrives when the things you feared losing are affirmed to be yours, and when the people who meant to rewrite your story are practically no longer in a position to do so. I use that liberty not for grand revenge, but for renewal. I had always loved the small business idea that had lived in the back of my mind, an event planning consultancy for people who wanted simple celebrations that did not cost a promise or a piece of themselves. A small corner shop where the food is honest and the tables are set by people who respect the work. With the inheritance cleared and the condo secure, I invested in that dream. Bud, who, in addition to being an ally, had the prudence of a prudent investor, put up seed money, not because he wanted to profit so much as he wanted to help someone he respected begin again. Aisha became my informal counsel and a part-time advisor. My son, when he was ready, offered to help with the logistics as a way of paying back, and he did so with the slow, deliberate focus of someone who had learned the weight of promises. Starting the business was less cinematic than I imagined. It involved permits and vendors, a morning filled with meetings about suppliers, and an evening spent tasting pastries in a kitchen that smelled of butter. It was work that used my age to advantage. People trusted me less for novelty and more for steadiness. We hired 2 women who had been in the catering trade for years and 1 young man who had little experience but plenty of heart. The first client asked for a small anniversary reception with a tone of plain sincerity. We did it well. I slept well that night in a way I had not for months. There were quieter reconciliations that the law could not confer. My relationship with my son did not mend overnight. Trust, once eroded, requires the slow architecture of proof. He made gestures that mattered. He sought help. He changed some of the careless habits that had let strangers into our family business, and he learned to answer texts with full adult sentences. None of that erased what had happened, but it made a path forward possible. We took small steps, often by way of shared meals that were, for the first time in a long time, ordinary. He started therapy. He reconnected with people he had let down. He was not restored to anything like his former naive self. He was a man who had discovered his limits and now tried to live inside them. People sometimes ask whether I regretted staying to face the room that night rather than walking away. There is a romantic image of retreat that suggests dignity and solitude. But dignity needs allies and facts. You cannot defend absence with justice. There are moments when the only honorable thing to do is to remain planted and trust that truth can be gathered and presented. That is what we did. I do not go around telling the story to make myself feel superior. I tell it to say this: you do not need to be loud to be firm. The law is patient with documents and not with performance. When you gather small things, bank notices, messages, a deed with an old stamp, you create a map that others cannot redraw without putting ink to paper. People who think they can erase you without signatures are often surprised when paper refuses to lie. In the months that followed, the social temperature cooled. Vanessa's legal drama moved through courts and into lesser-known headlines. Hayes faced his questions elsewhere. The viral videos, like any viral thing, burned bright and then found quieter corners online where people replayed them for a while and then moved on. No one had a monopoly on humiliation, and everyone knows how unevenly life distributes fortune. My business grew in a modest way. We catered small events, always making sure contracts were clear and signatures informed. I hired a younger woman named Lena who had the energy I lacked and the digital savvy I admired. She taught me things about social media and about how to present our modest craft to an audience that wanted authenticity over polish. We made a point, in the way small companies can, of paying people fairly. That was part of my quiet correction. We would not build our success on the backs of someone else's insecurity. There were afternoons when I would sit on the small balcony of my condo and think about the table that night. I would remember the light catching on crystal and the sound that a palm makes against skin, an indignity, but one that had become an instrument. If you had told me a year prior that a slap would be the hinge on which the next year turned, I might have rolled my eyes. Life is not neat. It is filled with moments that arrive as accidents and become opportunities if you have the patience to assemble the evidence. The son I love is not the same man who, for a while, let himself be swayed by the easy options. He is more careful with promises now. He is not entirely reformed. No human is, but he is present in a way that I can respect. The business brings me purpose and a daily practice of making things that last: menus, events, friendships. I do not spend days inventing revenge in private. I use my energy for work that feeds others and keeps my mind busy. Occasionally, people come to me for advice, not because I am wise, but because they want to know the shape of a life that does not fold under betrayal. I tell them what did for me: gather facts, find counsel, choose allies who understand paperwork as well as people, and do not be humiliated into silence. Justice is not the same as vengeance. Justice restores a record. Vengeance seeks to wound and lingers without repair. Now, when a couple comes to us for a small vow renewal, I watch them with the kind of care that used to be the crust over worry. I see who speaks for whom and who signs what. People always want the picture, the moment, the curated memory. My business gives them the memory without the price of erasure. It feels like a moral business to be in, one that rewards clarity and not showmanship. If there is a lesson I would wish to leave you with, beyond the obvious about verifying bank statements and reading calendar entries, it is this: the world will always prefer a story that is pretty and convenient. When you suspect that convenience is a cover for removal, collect the inconvenient records. Do not be afraid of paper. It is a quiet ally. I do not end with triumphalism. I end with a steadiness that I learned the hard way. The slap was an ugly punctuation mark, but not the definition of my life. The legal remedies were necessary, and they worked as they were intended to in our story. The human work, rebuilding, forgiving where it is genuine, holding firm where trust was broken, that took longer and required patience. In time, I found work that suited my hands and friends who were steady. I found that having a voice to say what happened with documents to back it up is a kind of freedom. If this story reached you and you found something familiar in it, tell me in the comments where you are from and what you would have done. And if you like these kinds of life-true narratives, watch another of our stories. There are more ordinary people who find extraordinary ways to correct their course. Thank you for listening.